talk fast. Okay, so I wanted to tie this in with Lauren, because I think what's important to remember, we talked about at the beginning of this event, we talked about, is it 2027? Maybe it's 2028. And I'm about to spend 10 more minutes talking to you about crisis preparedness, things that operators desperately need to do in the next 18 months in order to be resilient against the threats that we've all been talking about. More importantly, the impacts we've all been talking about. The problem with these sort of framings and this effort of, is it 2027, is it 2028, is, the tie-in here, why it's good to have this sort of secure by design type thinking, is if we get to 2028, 2029, nothing happens, it'll be like all of the other emergency response plans and a lot of the efforts that we've done in the past. It's easy for that stuff to gather dust, to lose training, and then when it matters most, when people catch us when our guard down, it's not effective. And so while we can call for people to do things now in the short term, the real long-term solution is ecosystem change. So I'm about to describe something that is the equivalent of uphill in the snow both ways for operators. And then we will pivot to how can we make that still uphill, but a slightly more paved path. So with that, let's get to CI Fortify. And I desperately look forward to my boss throwing me under the bus by saying, ask him all the hard questions. So please keep it coming. CI Fortify is really the emergency planning effort to when the Five Eyes OT community got together and said, we have 2 years, 18 months. What can we reasonably get operators to do to make it so that they can survive an impact to their systems? And how can we actually push in those levers? Because if we ask people to do 30 things, 36, 37 things, if we ask people to do 10 things, 20 things, inevitably with the time constraints that people have in the middle of budget cycles, people will only get to a couple of things in the next few years. So let's focus on the 2 things that we know will really work to meet this crisis. So, you heard my director talking about this morning, right? It's how can we make sure that critical infrastructure keeps running in a crisis? They take a punch and they keep delivering services. It's a big ask. It's not an easy ask, but that's the goal here, right? So in terms of the impacts motivating CI Fortify, it's really about kind of 2 things. One, from a telecommunications failure perspective, no phones, no internet, like we've seen with exercises like GridX, nobody is really well prepared to operate in an actual telecommunications outage. Even the large players that Mark was pointing to in the earlier talk with GridX, even they struggle, right? Critical infrastructure fails widely and dramatically without telecoms. And what we've noticed and seen is that, as you've seen from headlines like China's Salt Typhoon spies are still hacking telecoms now by exploiting Cisco routers. That was widely interpreted to be they were doing espionage. They must only be doing espionage. Let's just kind of ignore Salt Typhoon. Let's focus on Vault, who's doing the actual operational impacts. But once you've hacked, as we've said, people have done with Salt Typhoon, once you've hacked backbone telecommunications infrastructure, you do a whole lot more than espionage. So how do we make sure that people are prepared for, at best case, denial of service, at worst case, your telco as an attack vector? Secondly, I focus on impacts here and not just the typhoons of the different varieties or the different threat actors, because we can see this across the different threat actors. Like we just saw in Poland, just in this last December, in Poland, around 60 RTUs, IEDs, and substations and manufacturing sites were bricked. They were rendered inoperable. They were not recoverable. The components had to be entirely replaced. And now I don't want to hear about it's an AI super weapon, it's OT novel, anything. My rallying cry to the infrastructure community is, please, dear God, make them use a CVE. It was all living off the land. They literally went to the web pages for all of these devices, and in the web app, just clicked upload firmware, uploaded firmware that they'd rewritten the first 255 bytes. And now everything was caught in a permanent reboot cycle that could not be fixed outside of some extensive hardware reverse engineering. So, from an impact perspective, the US government is concerned about telecommunications outage. We know it requires a lot of planning for people to operate with no phones, no internet. 2, we know that if we had that scenario happen at scale across the United States, in Poland, it was 60 Hitachi devices. And I'm not calling out Hitachi as any particular vendor. This is true for all of them, right? Like lack of firmware signing or bypasses for firmware signing are rampant in OT technology. If that happened at scale across the United States, we would just run out of components. There's not enough Rockwell, Schweitzer, pick your favorite. There's not enough components in the country. We would have months to years long outages, particularly if you consider where some of the backups would come from in a crisis situation. They may not be giving them to us. So those are the 2 impacts we're concerned about. And so let's get to, what is the real goal and how are we going to try to mitigate those impacts? There we go. So the motivating question is, how do we make sure that if there's a poly crisis, a lot of incidents all at once, like multiple colonial pipeline levels of things, and we don't have bone and internet services, how can we make sure that people actually are capable of sustaining services? But simply, next time we have a colonial pipeline, how do we make it so that they go from not 100% service delivery to zero? How do we make it they go to 100 to 30, 100 to 40, 100 to X, where X is continuity of the economy, health and public safety, defense critical infrastructure, and national security. As you've seen from a lot of how we think about emergency management and response as like a country, particularly in the energy sector, we're very focused on the idea of black start. How do we take a degraded system and restore it back to normal? We as a country have done far less planning focused on how do we operate silos that continue to function because we are desperate for those things to function, and not trying to immediately race back to everything is operating as normal, because if we are actively under attack, everything will not be able to operate as normal and we will just have limited resources. The success metric for CI Fortify, as I see it, it is not the number of engagements, it is not who we talk to, it is functional exercises. Can you actually do a day without SCADA exercise? Can you do an IT-OT separation exercise? Call it a manual exercise, call it a local exercise, what have you. Can you, with your existing staff, test your ability to, one, isolate, disconnect from third parties and continue operations, by defining that service delivery target for yourselves? And two, can you work out recovery? What are your actual requirements, and can you actually test your backups and their ability to work in that degraded environment? That is already a huge ask for organizations, but that is the kind of planning that is necessary to make sure that things work in a telecommunications outage, because there's so many unanswered questions, which we'll get to in this talk, about what breaks when that actually happens, right? So why are we saying isolation and recovery as our two things? So we're saying two things are going to work. One is the point I brought up earlier, in the event of an incident responders, the cyber people, we are the long tail. We will not show up in any timely manner. What's going to happen is the engineer is going to notice that something isn't working. They're going to immediately pop it off the shelf and then replace it with whatever they have in backup, at which point, if attackers are bricking things, if they're degrading components, that exact same thing will happen, and now we're out of hardware. So, the answer from especially a cyber agency cannot be, let us retrain all of our operators and all of our professional engineers across the country to act differently, such that cyber's interests are first at heart. That just can't be the answer. Maybe in the long term, there's something there, but in the short term, it really gets to the point of, how do we actually make sure that when people do that equipment replacement, they are setting themselves up in such a way that they do not actively get bricked? So that's where the isolation piece comes from. Additionally, fundamentally operating in isolation is the same operating environment as if your comms were taken out on your behalf. So I would prefer you to choose your time and place for when those comms are taken out, rather than it being degraded and you operating in true uncertainty. And you can see this in guidance from other agencies focusing on encryption of telecommunications lines. CI Fortify is really black sky planning. It's focused not so much on protecting the information going across, though you absolutely should. Don't trust your carrier networks. Don't trust your vendor networks. Don't trust anything going upstream, downstream. To that point, thanks, Doc, for laughing. It's great. It's not quite zero trust. It's just cynical, but it's to that end, right? Then recovery. My lovely, in the spirit of Josh Corman, my motto for the recovery side is, nobody is coming to save you unless you have prearranged to be saved. In a communications outage, you cannot call your vendor support. You cannot call your managed service provider or your engineering firm. Plenty of water in the country. If your SCADA goes down, you are not fixing it yourself. You don't have the engineers to do so. This is also increasingly true with distributed energy, where you are calling in a third party to fix it for you. Everybody's going to be pretty resource strapped. And so where is that third party coming? How do you actually make sure that you can get the support you need and operate autonomously? Not permanently, not optimally. Again, the goal isn't 100%, the goal is 30%, the goal is 40%. Can you operate and recover to a degraded state where things can work without that third-party support coming within your usual 4 hours, 12 hours? And then finally, a lot of backup and restoration planning just won't work. Devices are increasingly interconnected, whether you would like them to be or not. Oil, natural gas turbine space is infamous for this, for embedding modems in components, whether or not it's in your contract. And so to that end, right, you might not even be able to proactively isolate from systems. You might have a licensing server that's necessary to restore your SCADA system. And that licensing server requires you to call your vendor in order to reconstitute it. If that is the case, and you don't know that that is the case, your backups are suddenly worthless because there's a phone or internet outage. And now we have our OEMs being the bottleneck to restoring our water systems, to restoring our energy grids, right? A lot of this is not worked out in terms of people have not tested around this no phones, no internet methodology. Vendors have increasingly designed away from this approach because they assume connectivity will be there. And so in the short term, we need to do the discovery work of knowing what breaks. And then as we'll get to, we need to do the long-term work of making it so the ecosystem, this is not a catastrophic guessing game, but instead something that you just know. It's part of a standard factory acceptance test, a FAT, whenever you buy a product. So CISA is doing some work to help operators do this. Again, to my point, the goal is a functional exercise. That is our mark of success. So we are doing work to help organizations get to the point where they can do that functional exercise. We have something called a brand new assessment we're working on called the CI Fortify assessment. I'll speak about this in brief because a lot of operator folks in the room. But really, the CI Fortify assessment is trying to get to 6 goals. We are trying to help you understand who are your tier 1 customers, who actually matters to you, who should receive care first. Now, we are not necessarily having the difficult conversations of, is it the trauma center, is it the dialysis center, or is it the military base, right? The goal and the point of emergency planning is to try and make it so you don't have to make those hard choices. It is saying your minimum service delivery target is the combined option of all of those, and that's not going to equal 100%, right? So basing it off of that, what control systems actually support that critical infrastructure? If you try to fix everything, if you try to maintain everything, particularly in a degraded communications environment, good luck. Just from a pure labor and logistics perspective, it's not going to go very well. So how do we reduce the problem set that you have to care about? And then finally, we think about it from the perspective of continuity, isolation, and recovery. Continuity, in the event that there's a communications outage, can you meet your service delivery thresholds in that communications outage? Isolation, can that reduced set of OT actually be proactively isolated in the event of an incident? The model here is really thinking about what happened in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the intelligence community was screaming from the top of their lungs for 3 months, Russia is going to invade Ukraine. No, they're really going to do it. Like, this is very serious. At which point, from a cyber perspective, we had efforts like Shields Up, but frankly, the problem with a lot of those approaches, particularly in the short time frame, was operators needed time to support it, but also it's not necessarily useful to tell people to do kind of standard cybersecurity practices that we wish they were doing anyway. CI Fortify, in saying isolation, is not saying air gap harder. It's saying you need to recognize that your third-party links that you rely on, your leased fiber lines, your PIP networks, your ASNs, your MPLS networks, all of these vendor connections that you have to have just to operate a reasonable business could potentially be unreliable. And the emergency planning here is all of the labor and staff required to operate in those crisis conditions. And so you might think you're air gap now. The more confidently you say that to me, the less convinced I am. But in that context, how can we actually make this real emergency planning so that if we do see troop movement on a border, if we do know something is coming, there's actionable steps that you can take as an organization to deal with it as an emergency and not just as, well, I guess I should be doing this anyway, because that doesn't really fly from an emergency planning perspective. And then finally, from a recovery, can that vital set of systems be restored without normal connectivity or routine outside support? And we have a little catch-all bottleneck at the end, which is any operational bottlenecks or structural constraints. So think consumables, think, if the rest are talking about, can you do it? It's a binary of continuity. This is really saying longevity. Are there consumable dependencies like chemicals and water? Or is there diesel fuel dependencies? How long can you actually sustain these operations? So that's the CI Fortify assessment and how we are helping operators actually do this at CISA. Again, with the goal of being an actual functional exercise. So with that said, I've described an uphill walk in the snow both ways. So what are the actual barriers to success? Because I've just said a lot. So really what I want to point out here is there's a lot of barriers for CI Fortify. I mean, there's a lot of text on the slide, but the real meat of it is, how do you create an incentive structure such that people are incentivized to continue operating in a degraded state, right? I mean, to use Colonial as the favorite example, depending on how cynical you are, Colonial came down because they couldn't do billing anymore and they couldn't make any money. or slightly less cynical, depending on who you talk to. They had liability issues. They opened themselves up to being sued by servicing one group, but not another. And there's a little bit of truth to all of these. Or there's the safety regulator side. FSMA said you can't maintain visibility over your pipes, even if you maybe think you could probably swing it. And so you cannot safely operate. There's all of these barriers, and then throw in from the product manufacturer side, if you have a warranty policy and the government is telling you practice isolation, well, that warranty policy might have an act of God or an act of war clearance to say, yeah, you can disconnect in that scenario. I mean, it's a hurricane. What are you going to do? But we're not going to sue you for that. But if you are proactively practicing emergency response, well, that might still void your warranty. So there's a lot of work to be done here. I bring these up not as a blocker. There's certainly much to be done. CISA is largely focusing, particularly in the next couple of months, releasing a lot of guidance to make sure that if that critical infrastructure entity, that colonial pipeline type entity wanted to continue operating, that they could from a practical engineering perspective. It takes a lot of work to be able to operate that pipeline in that degraded condition, or that substation, that energy grid, that water system in those degraded conditions. And these are all other barriers to really point out how to create the incentive structure for this to work. And this goes on because if we're really thinking about this crisis situation, there's going to be ambiguity. There's ambiguity just from a knowledge perspective, like we talked about earlier. Will my backups work? What's hard-coded in the system? We're having a fun conversation with a vendor where in order to reestablish your SCADA server, it's really just software running on a Windows system, but it's hard-coded to the MAC address. So you basically have to call up the vendor to recover, not for any real practical reasons, but because it's hard-coded to the MAC address. And I happened to be talking to a cybersecurity lead there who said, oh, I wrote up that code. Actually, you can change that MAC address. It's not really hard-coded. I was like, okay, is that documented? Well, no, I wrote that feature like 10 years ago. It's definitely not documented. Okay, maybe we could fix that. And then, or like what's locally cached, right? Or from a, hospital or healthcare perspective, the easiest dependency from a service side is Epic, right? Electronic healthcare records. In the event that there's an outage, maybe because your internet goes down or maybe because Epic goes down, in that scenario, what's locally cached? Is it caching all of the patient healthcare records on site so that the hospital maybe can't take in new patients very easily, but everybody who is actively receiving treatment can still receive records and can still be treated safely? It's ambiguous. It doesn't know. We don't properly document and display all of these failure modes in our equipment. And then a quick little plug, because Josh loves cyber insurance. A lot of the cyber insurance, a lot of the incident response, the first call is to the cyber insurance provider, at which point we're in a fun, ambiguous situation in a lot of these crisis situations, where from a military and force protection planning, those first couple of days, those first couple of hours are critical for maintaining services. But the incentive from your insurance provider is often, well, we'll send an incident response firm, don't touch anything until we get there because we need to verify what's going on. And so we need to make sure that our incentives for people continuing to operate, providing lifeline services, is not actively against either regulation, safety waivers, or things like cyber insurance and things like that. How do we actually get these things to work together? My favorite example is from some German colleagues where a factory is mandated to have an emissions external connection. It tells the government the current emissions of that plant. The emissions connection went down. They couldn't fix it. And the plant decided it was cheaper to shut down the entire plant than pay the legal fees for that emissions connection. So to my knowledge, knock on wood, that is not as bad in the United States. But how do we make sure that the incentives are aligned for, in an emergency, people keep going, right? From a lessons learned in Ukraine, right? In a real wartime scenario, people stop caring about billing and caring about metering. That's like a wartime mentality that happens. There's a lot of ambiguity, and in order to prevent the wartime scenario, honestly, that is the most important part, is that ambiguous period. So how do we make sure services happen during that? Now, with that said, the fun here is it 2027 or bust? Okay, so 2027 passed, we say, or 2028 passed. So say January 29 happens, we say, okay, well, all of our security budgets get cut because the big scary boogeyman didn't happen, and we're all Chicken Little. And then they just wait a couple of years and then it happens. So the only way to make things like CI Fortify work in the long term is asking, how do we make this just part of resilience planning, part of the OT ecosystem, so this is easier over time? So To that end, right? If from a crisis planning perspective, how can we make sure that this results in a more stable ecosystem? And I want to tackle this through a couple lenses. One is secure by design. Two is secure by deployment. And you can see the tie-in more to Lauren's talk. And three is resilient communities. So from a secure by design perspective, excuse the pun, the goal here is really to understand how can we make these sort of emergency planning efforts evergreen. So I have a fir tree. Thank you. Very proud of that one. I get a lot of ridiculous names through at CISA, and at some point somebody will fire me, but that's okay. So, the goal here is really understanding in a crisis, we can't afford to be asking questions. We can't afford to be doing similar to the vuln-apocalypse conversation we're all having right now. If we all have to do at the operator level, like we do, independent testing of patches because we're worried it might break something at scale, I mean, it just doesn't work. Everybody is paying an absurd amount of money to replicate testing infrastructure over and over and over again. So how do we make it so that it doesn't have to happen for these failure states planning? Right? There's a lot of ways a system can fail. Right? If we're talking about SCADA in the cloud, a lot of these water systems is they might be entirely controlled by a third-party vendor out in the cloud. And how does it fail when that cloud connection goes down? Now, I can tell you with a fair good amount of confidence that the usual answer is it will do whatever it was told to do the last time it was told to do it. We're talking to the different vendors, man. So Josh is shaking his head in the back for the people in the room. So in that perspective, that might be good, that might be bad. Maybe you're in high storm conditions and, well, it got broken at that point. You didn't realize it got broken. And then, well, your pumps are still acting like it's high storm conditions. And so now you have another problem. Maybe it's failing in a known degraded state, right? It senses that it doesn't have communications and it goes to what it considers safe. Or maybe it just hard fails and stops working. Do you know for all of your individual products? Is that well documented? I can easily say no. And this has to be done. This is something that we need to work on to make that work. I would also add to that isolatability, especially as we're embedding more modems in these pieces of equipment. If the operator wanted to disconnect it, right now there's mandatory connections to a lot of these vendor products. If the vendor is nice, it will go through your DMZ and you can kind of route it by investing a lot of money in firewalls and other infrastructure to secure that connection. Instead, can we put the control back in the operator's hands so that they can actually do the isolation themselves? At fee of losing warranty policies and what have you, the vendor can protect themselves legally, but we need to make sure that that is still in the hands of the operator. And the same is true as for recovery. How do we make sure that from a recovery perspective, I don't need to call up the vendor in order to get at least something working in the short term? And then this goes for the same for secure by deployment, right? Like how do we set up integrators for success? They're the ones buying a lot of the actual equipment. We released some guidance called Secure Connectivity Principles for Operational Technology. I personally love it. I think it's the best piece of guidance we've managed to put out as an allied nation with our Five Eyes and European partners. And it really gets to the point of how do we set up contracting models that give operators control over connectivity, over privileged access workstations, and more importantly, how do we remove all this low-hanging fruit, the internet-exposed OT, the unpatched, unmonitored edge devices, the default credentials? How do we make them use, to my eternal creed, how do we make the threat actor use a CVE in the OT environment, right? Like the answer is like the secure deployment and the OEM case. So with that, I'll wrap things up. Oh, okay, not too bad. What's next for CI Fortify? If you're an operator or an OEM or system integrator, please reach out. I think my email is on the next slide. We are doing technical exchange and working groups to help bolster some of these things so that when we talk about FIR and these kinds of planning we want in a factory acceptance test, it is not the killer app that helps you sell features, but is instead a normal part of safety testing. So we have CISA convening authorities that allowed us to do that in an antitrust protected way. Please contact us and get involved. We also are coming out with more isolation recovery guidance to help people do this, as well as lessons learned from our CI Fortify assessment with the intent to publish all of those resources publicly. So your bottleneck to receiving a CI Fortify assessment is not CISA staff. Thank God. I'm going to rack up a lot of hotel miles. And then finally, as a call to action, test your PACE plans. Do this day without SCADA exercise. Create these resilient communities. Talk with your local critical infrastructure operators about what is the actual failure state. If you're a hospital, maybe you have 2 hours to failure, but you have emergency planning that actually extends it to 6. Maybe you have backup generators for water, so your failure state isn't actually a loss of power. Your failure state is actually after 24 hours, your people who are doing water sampling in a communications outage, there's only 3 of them and they cannot physically keep themselves awake anymore. Understanding those failure states is what is critical to making us more resilient. So with that, CISA.gov/Fortify, and happy to answer any questions. So I think I'm exactly at time. So sorry, Josh.
I'm going to ask the next panel to start coming up here, but will you take one question maybe? And then some in the hallway?
I will stay here so you can
Is there a question?